All right. Looks like okay. We I don't know why this says an API team meeting, but whatever. So here we are. We're live on YouTube, and let me promote. Let's see. Okay, so today we have Daniel from TC39 who came in and dropped an issue and says he wants to collect some feedback, something from outreach groups. Just I'm not sure exactly what he wants to ask, so that's why he's here, and I'd like to put him on the spot and start with whatever questions he might have for our group. So have at it, Daniel.
Hi. So there are a number of different TC39 proposals that touch on tooling, and I'm really interested in getting feedback from the broader JavaScript community about it, including this group, which seems like a great way to start. We have developments in modules. I know that's being discussed a lot in the modules group, but also decorators, and there's a whole set of like both transpilers and bundlers that are implemented in Node.js. And so I'm not sure exactly what the membership of this group is, but it's one thing that I've been doing in the past is going through proposals, technical issues in proposals in TC39 and summarizing them and asking people if they have comments that or technical suggestions that we should bring to the committee. And so I'm wondering if that kind of thing would be interesting for this
group. I would certainly find this interesting. I think one of the projects I represent is Istanbul, which is a transpiler that uses Babel. So if there is anything affecting transpilers, that interests me. The other topic on my mind that might touch on TC39 is source maps, which I was going to bring up at some point in this conversation today. Like if there's any specific, I know V8 is planning on implementing source maps this year. I'm curious if it's to any spec though. So I was going to bring that up too.
Yeah, there's not a solid spec for source maps, and it's not owned by any particular standards body. So I don't actually know the details of what they want to implement.
Well, that's good to know. I think in general, though, I mean, certainly anything that would be, affect a node, that would be amazing to have a summary in this meeting so that we don't have to read through, all of the actual documents and can just have an expert kind of give us the talking points.
I mean, there's a lot to talk about. I'm not sure what sorts of details you'd be interested in, but one great thing that some people in TC39 have been doing is publishing a summary of each meeting that's published in the notes repository. So you can start from there, and then I'm happy to elaborate on any extra details.
Cool. Are there any specific, like you brought up transpilers, are there any specific specs that touch on like the future of transpilation, out of curiosity?
Well, as an example of feedback we got from transpilers, the current decorators proposal sort of expands out into a lot of code, and that was so it's not clear whether that should be a design goal, but that was one kind of piece of feedback we got. There's also a lot of sort of speculation about for linting tools, like will it be practical to lint against a particular condition, for static analysis kind of tools like type systems or tree shaking, like whether it will be possible to do something using that. And people have different ideas in the committee about that, and just consulting with domain experts would probably be a big benefit to us.
That sounds amazing. And so the concern is that language features are introduced that just make like linting or transpilation or what have you, basically much more difficult because of the new language constructs.
That's one dimension of concern, but on the other hand, we could have language features which provide improvements there, like modules providing improvements on tree shaking capabilities, and maybe that other things work that way in the future, or like more built-in functionality having a decreasing effect on bundle size, which is a thing that tools are going for, or dynamic import allowing code splitting. Or probably there are things that you all in the tools ecosystem know about that we don't know about in TC39, that you have like knowledge from your relevant experience about the needs. And so it would be great to surface those as well.
Cool. That sounds amazing. It would be good to have that crosstalk happening. I think what we could maybe do on our end too is to this meeting, we know a bunch of folks who work on Babel, and we know a few folks who work on Lerna and some of the other tools in the community. It would be good, I think, to get more of a cross representation to this meeting, which because I think that would bring you more value as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. We have Babel participating in TC39, but I don't know if anybody in Lerna is participating right now. And there's a lot of other things.
Totally. Yeah, the reality is that like a lot of what people are using Node.js for is rating tooling. So, once there's a front end on that transpiler or that test coverage library or that unit testing library, a lot of the time the CLI is written in Node. So having more of a connect there, I think is glad you reached out to us. This is what I'm saying.
Great. Well, thanks for having me here.
So I'd like to hit up on two things. Well, one thing I heard you say was bundling. That's a long-standing dream of mine. Anything that standard can provide to get us into a simpler situation regarding bundling, and which made me think about two things. One is some sort of standardized abstract syntax tree or intermediate representation as a standard, which I think all of the transpilers / static analyzers / linters will need an AST, but things like that have been. So one of the things I hear from the VI team is that they don't want to expose either their AST or IR because it's non-standard, and they want to be able to go crazy with it without worrying about breakage. So if there was a standard, at least there were some common ground. And the other thing, which is I might not interest, maybe it's not TC39, but like a metaphor for a file system. Although most of the work is done for the web, and we have URLs, tools work with file systems, and some standards around that might be very interesting also for us.
What exactly standards around?
So you've brought up a whole bunch of different things. So maybe I could try to address them one by one. About bundling, there is an emerging set of proposed web standards that tries to reduce the need for that. And one thing that I personally don't know is what the tooling ecosystem will look like for supporting those. So there's the web package, or it's also called bundled exchange proposal, which is being implemented in Chrome, but it's not yet standard, but it's being prototyped. And what Bundled Exchange does is allow a number of different resources to be bundled into one single thing that's sent over the network. So the hope with HTTP2 push was that would resolve this, that would make it cheap to send over a bunch of different things. But there were a number of different issues with HTTP2 push, including compatibility across browsers, but also the difficulty of configuring it. So Bundled Exchange fits more into a workflow of you create a bundle and you serve it. And that bundle could include not just JavaScript and CSS and HTML, but also images or video or whatever different resources you want to include packaged together. And for including CSS, for example, it doesn't have to convert it into JavaScript or anything like that.
So like in the tool world, it's interesting in less from the point of concern of bandwidth or chatter over a protocol, but in the sense of versioning and speed and optimizations and something akin to compilation. But the idea is kind of similar. You have JavaScript, you have configuration files, you might have some text resources. So like I'm saying the constraints or the imperatives are a little bit different when you think web and when you think local tool. So, that's something I think that's interesting.
I'm confused. I'm not really sure what you're asking. I was describing how bundling can work at a serving level.
Yeah, so I'm saying
can use this.
So if you think of, like I'm thinking about a project like Think, like something that uses a bundle to enable a tool that runs on the file system and not in the browser, and has a very low friction in terms of installation and size and speed. So I'll give you an example. npm comes as I think it's 27,000 files in its node modules directory. And theoretically, if we could bundle it into a single file and distribute it as such, and have a standard way of parsing it and running it, that's a nice added value.
Yeah, I think this fits within the broader goals of Bundled Exchange. I could send a link to the explainer, which describes these different use cases, and this really seems like part of that.
Sounds great to me. I think like when I think of just from the point of view of the NPM community where I've worked for years, like Webpack creates a lot of confusion for people, and the other bundlers do. So like kind of moving towards a standard that just in a centralized place addresses some of the confusion in the community around like what order do I need to bundle in, what transforms do I need. I think that would be a huge benefit for the community, for the front end and the back end.
It might not be a TC issue, but I think the first question people who are starting to deal with tools, especially now in the Lambda age, is why can't I Webpack my backend? And that's because it's not a standard. It's an evolved solution for a very specific problem. And the only thing that I would ask the committee, 39, is to think about JavaScript outside of the web front end. For instance.
So TC39 definitely tries to avoid a coupling to the web. Maybe even, well, for my taste, sometimes maybe a little bit excessively. Web package is not being defined. Bundled exchange is not being defined in TC39, but rather it's part of the W3C Web Incubator community group. And it's being championed by Google, with the standards eventually going to some W3C working groups and some IETF working groups. It's sort of on top of the definition of JavaScript itself. There's another related technology which is needed to subsume some of Webpack's functionality. Not together, there would still need to be tooling, just lighter weight tooling. And this is called import maps. Import maps allow you to use normal specifiers and then have a map that resolves them to where the code is. And so you can use a short name for the module that doesn't have JS or things like that when you're importing. And so we could have a build tool that emits these. Import maps also allow you to have fallbacks for CDNs or for polyfills for built-in modules, if we had built-in modules.
Yeah, so is import maps is a standard, is like a JavaScript standard?
Import maps is also being developed in the Web Incubator community group, which means it's pretty early. It's not yet a standard, but it's being investigated closely by different web browsers. But it's also not at the JavaScript level, but at the web level. What we're considering in TC39 is certain new features for modules, as well as decorators, which might have something to do with this, but it's still somewhat unclear. There's an asset reference proposal which ties into tooling.
I think at a meta level, like without going into each of the specific standards on this call, because we there's a bunch and probably will want to talk over time and other channels with you. Like I think at a meta level, what's being hit on, and I think it came up really clearly as Node tries to implement modules, and modules has been behind a flag in Node for 2 years now because it hasn't reached consensus in the community in some regards. And I think it is this disconnect between how the internet, how like a web browser wants to represent resources with URI, and how Node tooling has represented it as a file system path forever, because it was built as a very file system centric set of APIs. So I think the point that finding more common ground, can we standardize on a URI? Like, I don't know, URIs are standard and they make sense, but can we make them more palatable through a set of APIs, maybe to the existing Node ecosystem around tooling? Like that, I think that would start to solve some bundling problems, some module system problems, and would help to kind of move these tools built for operating systems closer to a bunch of standards that do sometimes are more web centric. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think this could be a theme as we talk together, TC39 and Node tooling. Like, how do we take the file system and make a set of tools around it that make it more easier to represent with URIs? Like, perfect example, NPM modules. It's nice that you can just require Lodash and not provide like a unique URI to some Lodash package version asset. I get why the community wants that, but it doesn't necessarily fit with the module system design, I don't think. So, and this is my 2 cents. And maybe we can help provide some common ground, or at least a point of view in that regard.
Well, I mean, at a URI or URL level, it seems good to me that Node is now shipping the Whatwig URL standard, which allows a common basis for parsing and includes file URLs. As far as these bare import specifiers, I think import maps is intended to be what bridges that gap. And I'm not an expert in Node modules, but my understanding was that it's not just about whether it's files on a file system, but also the difference in cost that in the web you can't afford to try different file locations the way that it's possible in Node, or just sort of the evolved over time nature of the Node module resolution algorithm.
Totally. And I mean, this is totally fair. I just think when you talk about tooling, like we have this corpus of 900,000 modules that have been written in one way, and like finding a way to move towards the perfect without leaving behind these, millions and millions and millions of lines of code that already exist. And this is an interest of mine, because it stinks having modules behind a flag, and I'd love to the meta, like, how can we make tooling better in the ecosystem is like, how do we move this community of packages forward?
I mean, it sounds like import maps, from your description, could be used to make, as has been said, make URIs more palatable to Node code. But you also said that import maps are not at the JavaScript level.
Right. So there's a lot of interesting issues going on. We develop different things in different standards bodies, and we all try to work together. But it can be hard to decide where to propose a standard for what thing, because in different standards bodies, you get the expertise of different people. But in my conversations recently, I've been asking a number of different people involved in standards if they would be interested in getting more feedback from Node. And the answer from basically everybody has been yes. People really do want to get this kind of feedback, and where it's feasible, bridge the gap between different JavaScript environments. And yeah, it's clear that a lot of the tooling that exists now is to bridge that gap. So
that makes perfect sense, Daniel. So going forward, like, what do you think a good way to kind of have this open dialogue is? Because I think, everyone involved in the tooling working group, we have opinions, we work on various tools, we'd like to give that feedback. And I wonder if there's a better way than every 3 weeks having a representative. Like, is there, I don't know, any recommendations you have to work on that dialogue?
I mean, honestly, it's something I'm still trying to figure out myself. These standard proposals are generally developed in the open on GitHub. And so it's always possible to just jump into there. But at the same time, that doesn't always work, because the people who are working on those proposals don't always have the full context of the people who are giving the feedback, and to understand each other's perspective. And so what I've tried to do with some other groups is talk to them separately and then try to bring that feedback over. But I'm also not sure. It's not really the best to have an intermediary either. So it's probably going to be an ongoing process to figure out how to get this feedback through.
I think what's kind of interesting with the Node community too is really we have the core Node collaborators and who are kind of have a more Node centric view of reality. And then we do have the NPM ecosystem, and I, full disclosure, I work for NPM. So NPM has its own set of concerns where, like, we've got this giant module ecosystem that, is really valuable and interesting, but doesn't always agree 100% with the direction Node would like to be going in. And then throw into that, we have the browser makers and TC39 and the emergent JavaScript standards. And you now have these three parties that all have their own interests and don't always see eye to eye on the best path forward. So it's probably beyond the scope of the tooling group.
Add into that, even within the various different standards groups, people don't always see eye to eye.
Exactly. Yes. So, but I mean, if the tooling working group could do any part to help bridge some of those gaps, we'd love to.
Something I think would be really valuable is if we can get more people from tooling involved in prototyping different things using these emerging standards. And that would probably be a great way to identify issues early on before they get widely shipped, so that they can be resolved. Because if something's already shipping to the web, then it's very hard to change it because people could be relying on it.
That's smart. So similar to kind of how Babel will do the prototype. Because one thing that comes to my mind, like amongst us, we know a lot of package makers. So like we could be reaching out to someone working on Webpack and say, hey, we think there's this emergent specification that might make bundling easier. Would you be willing to make a command line tool that just uses this emergent standard? That may be a bad example because it's not TC39, but you know what I'm saying.
So a good example of this, I think, is JDD's ESM. So like Babel, it's this userland tool that will allow you to essentially use ES modules with Node in a way that works really well for people building stuff with Node. And I mean, I'm sure, is TC39 aware of that project? I'm sure they are. So
yeah, Babel comes to many people from the Babel project come to many TC39 meetings.
No, I mean John David Dalton's ESM module.
Enable that.
Not Babel. The ESM module.
Oh yeah, we're aware of that, and people have opinions about it. I don't have a real opinion about it, but we're discussing, at the past couple TC39 meetings, we have discussed various ways of certain core components of how Node can integrate with ES modules.
Okay,
the whole committee has a full understanding of it, but there's definitely a core group of people in the committee who are thinking deeply about these things.
Right.
I want to step back and respond to something else that was being said. So we were talking about something that's like Babel for using these new features. I'm thinking about something that's like Babel, but sort of in a different sense. You know how today with Babel preset env, you can say, I'm only going to compile my website so that it works for the more recent browsers. And then your bundle size might be smaller because it might not have to compile away async await or some things like that end up blowing up the code. So in particular, with something like web package, bundled exchange, or import maps, the building step doesn't have to be as intensive. The building step can output things that are closer to the original source code. And so that's the kind of experimentation that I think we need with some of these technologies that are specifically designed to make the tooling more lightweight.
Cool. You know what's I think a really good example is I've been championing. So V8 exposes test coverage now. It's not a standard. I honestly wonder if we could advocate that we start to standardize it better. But TLDR, Chrome, and V8 have built-in test coverage now. And I've built this little tool called C8, which just exposes through the inspector the test coverage, this like feature that was in the browser but not in Node land, and now it is in Node land through this little tool. It's janky because it's a brand new feature and they're all emergent specs. But I bet we could be doing this for a bunch of other things, and I think that's a really cool idea. It's because it lets people get a taste of these features. I love it because it lets people get a taste of some of these emergent features. So here's what I'll find frustrating. Let me share a frustration. I feel like in the module discussion, basically, which I've basically walked away from at this point because I feel like we were all talking over each other in the Node and NPM world. Like one of the issues was, well, we want to be able to move forward our existing ecosystem of 900,000 packages. And then someone would inevitably answer, well, you could use package maps to do this and it would give you the same imports. But then you're like, well, geez, like you're asking us to use a feature that's only slightly emerged and there's no tooling to actually even try this feature out yet. would be if we actually had some tooling built around these emergent standards that allow you to try it out, then it's like a way to say, oh yeah, I guess this could be a way to move some of these packages forward. And by the way, here's a tool that actually does this. So I think it can be a good way of taking something where it's like, maybe this will solve the problem, this emergent standard, and saying, oh no, it actually does solve the problem. We can actually see it in action. It stops talking over each other, and it becomes I don't know, just feels like a better resolution to some of these issues.
Isn't
Sorry,
that
blathering a little bit? Yeah, but
I mean, I think that sounds like a great vision. Like, I spent enough time arguing in TC39 itself. I didn't come here to go and argue. I wanted to talk about like positive ways forward about these things, and that sounds like a great one. But at the same time, it's clear that building these practical tools is not a sure way to get people not to be upset at you. You can see lots of people pretty upset about the JDD's ESM thing. And so I'm not really sure a solution to that problem, but definitely seems like a productive way to investigate these things.
That's exactly how I feel. Like, I think like it's frustrating when someone comes in to a thread and is like, well, you don't need to be worried because we have this emergent standard that will solve the problem. It's way less frustrating if someone comes in and says, look, here's this tool that is written to this emergent standard, and look how easy it makes to do what you're talking about. It really flips the conversation.
Yeah, so my goal would be not to come in and say, hey, here is the solution to your problem, but rather like, would this work for your problem? And I don't know how people came in the past about that, but that's sort of the tone I want to take in these conversations.
Right. I'm curious about, okay, so if we have these experimental tools out there, and maybe it's this package breath thing, maybe whatever it is, how does TC39 know that, okay, this tool exists and it's a prototype and people are using it and it works for them? How do we get that feedback back to you? Or how does TC39 know that once, experimental tooling has been out there and people are trying to use it, how does TC39 know that it's actually helpful? How does it prove, the theories out or whatever?
Well, if people have had experience with a proposal, whether positive or negative, what I would encourage you to do is to file an issue in GitHub on the proposal repository and describe how it worked and describe whether it worked for you, whether it didn't work for you. I know that issues are kind of a funny way to say that something worked, but really as a proposal champion, these sorts of posts about what worked or what didn't work, both of them, are really valuable. I think people get the idea that when they do see something about the proposal, they have to bring it to an abstract level and say, okay, fundamentally this is wrong because of that. When really the more interesting thing is more, how did this work for your use cases? And from there, it's mostly a process of working with the proposal champions. If it's hard to get through to the proposal champions, then you can talk to other people involved. In the case of, well, this is confusing because at certain points in time, it was called like module maps or package name maps and now import maps. That proposal isn't being developed in TC39. It's being developed more among browser vendors. So it's because it's not in a particular standards committee yet. It's in YCG. So discussing that with them is probably the more actionable.
I feel like that puts a lot of burden on the people trying to give feedback. I feel like it would be more helpful if there was like a suggestion box that we could drop something in and TC39 could take that and forward it to the correct people, or having a town hall or a discussion like this even would be great, where I don't have to know even what proposal I'm talking about. I don't have to know who the author is or where the repo is or anything, because most people don't.
One thing we're thinking about for TC39 is setting up discourse YCG already has a discourse, and that's a forum for more kinds of free-form discussion. A challenge which I'm sure you all face as open source project maintainers or contributors is actually extracting the quality feedback out of it. Sometimes people come in with a kind of aggressively negative stance about things. And there's something about the format of GitHub that seems to especially encourage this and then make it hard to get the more nuanced things. So I hope the discourse could be helpful. I'm not sure if you have suggestions from your open source experience about this.
Well, I think the recommendation I would make is I think why I jumped at your idea that it would be fun to rate some tooling is that the actual action of making even an imperfect tool, I think, makes a lot more impact than just discussion. Discussion, there's already too much discussion. But actually, like the Babel, I think that's part of why Babel's been so incredible for moving forward JavaScript, is because you can actually play with an emergent standard and see how the feature feels, and it just makes a huge difference, right? So I'd rather see more like making little toys that let us test something like module maps, even though it's not TC39, or more projects like what Babel facilitates and less conversation, because I think the conversation can be where it devolves into just arguing about the perfect solution without actually getting anything done.
Yeah, and with import maps, you actually can try out a polyfill. I mean, in the import maps repository, there's sort of a reference implementation under development, and in parallel, Guy Bedford has a shimport or a variant of that does some of the same things, but with a parallel implementation, and as well sort of things that make dynamic import work in the browser if the browser doesn't support it. There's a lot of experimentation going on here, but I hope we can broaden the group of people who's involved in that, because different people approach the same problem in different ways.
That makes perfect sense. Well, I don't know the magic bullet. I personally like Slack because I like real-time conversation, but that's not everyone's bag. I kind of agree that GitHub issues tend to devolve.
Although I'm not the chair, but we're 45 minutes in. I would like then give me a short partitioning of the problem areas. Like, where does TC39 see itself in the ecosystem? I want to give a comparison. Like in Python, there's the language, there's the standard library, testing is a standard, coverage, profiling, the AST, the intermediate, the IR, everything is part of Python, the standard. What does TC39 see? It's self-responsible.
Well, formally, TC39 sees is self-responsible for the JavaScript programming language. But there's a lot of things that you could think of as maybe in the JavaScript programming language or maybe not. So for example, all of the syntax of JavaScript has to be in the JavaScript programming language. But what do we do about different pieces of, for example, the standard library? We have things like Intel, the internationalization standard library, as part of TC39's work, whereas other common libraries that are shared between the web and Node, like URL or text encoder, are outside and developed in Whatwig. I think it's ultimately kind of a blurry line between these things. And I want to just promote alignment across the ecosystem, regardless of which different standards venue. There's been discussion very recently as we consider built-in modules about how much of how built-in modules work should be defined in TC39 and how much should be defined in external web standards. And It's still something that we're going to work out as time evolves.
Makes sense. So it sounds like we're in an exciting time where we're trying to define, literally in the process of trying to define how the communication happens across like 4 different groups in such a way that we have like a cohesive thing that's good for the community.
Yeah, exciting is one way to put it.
Sure, frustrating, exciting, whatever.
Okay, so I think we probably need to wrap up this discussion. But so how do we want to continue, Daniel, having this conversation with you for now?
One thing we could do is participate in the Node Open Standards repo, where we're planning on having discussions in GitHub threads in a repository in the Node organization about different proposed standards. I'm not sure if that would be an appealing medium to the people here. The discussion that we had a one-off call to discuss how Node could be more involved in standards, but this was more with Node core people. And we decided not to make any particular standing meeting, but instead to have issue threads where we could discuss things. And then when we get to a point where we have something substantial that we want to come to a conclusion on, then maybe we would establish a call to discuss one particular proposed standard. So I'm not sure, does that format sound good for you? Or do you think we should do something separate to specifically engage tooling?
I mean, that sounds okay to me. I mean, we certainly we could have more calls like this as necessary. Sure. What does everybody else think?
I think that I think just making it like, this has been great because it's kind of a brain dump. It's the first time Daniel's been on the call, but maybe having like it would be great to continue to have a representative, but have it maybe only be a small part of the agenda in upcoming meetings. And so if that means we have a second call occasionally, just to get a few folks together, I think that could be good. Honestly, I would say like, we do have, NPM does have one representative on TC39, but having like a couple, getting someone from NPM could be good too, someone from Node, and just get people from a few of these bodies would be interesting, because it sounds like a call where we get all the people who are
trying to do that in TC39. We haven't seen NPM at TC39 for a little while. It'd be great to have you back.
Cool. I'm about to go to work after this call, so I'll bring it up with the folks, because I think the problem is, I want to see more communication between everyone, because I think when you go back to your project and you're like, TC39 doesn't understand Node, or Node doesn't understand NPM, like this is where you end up with these obnoxious GitHub threads. There's absolutely no reason for it.
Oh yeah, I agree completely.
Yeah. So I will prod someone and get them to your meetings.
Oh, that's great. I'm so excited.
Okay, so Daniel, do you think you or somebody else would be able to at least pop in for a few minutes? We meet every 3 weeks. Would that work, or do you want to? What do you think?
Yeah, I can try to come to the next one.
Okay.
I feel bad about coming in and then sort of taking up almost the whole meeting. So I'd be interested to hear what you talk about next time.
Okay.
Yeah, there's nothing to feel bad about. I think it was good. I think it's a bunch of pent up, like, how do we get all these different groups of frustrating people communicating? So that's all that happened today. It was just a good conversation.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you then, Daniel, for dropping in and having this talk with us. And yeah, don't feel bad. I don't feel like I don't feel bad that we're almost out of time or anything. So as far as other agenda items, there wasn't too much. One thing I wanted to bring up was, so this meeting is every 3 weeks, which I'm not sure I like that. But if the reason it's every 3 weeks is because we're conflicting with some other group at this time slot on a Tuesday, and they meet every 3 weeks. And so, if we want to keep this time slot, essentially, we're not going to be live on YouTube unless we meet every 3 weeks. Now, I don't know what the reason is why we can't have 2 live streams happening at once, but that's that. Does anybody want to meet more often than every 3 weeks?
I'm fine with I'm fine with the 3 weeks, but I do get like full disclosure. Like Chris and I will talk and chat outside of our meetings, so I feel like I'm having a bit of and I do with other people in the tooling community. So maybe making our Slack more official, like maybe switching to the Node tooling, maybe switching to the actual whatever the Node one is. I don't know if that would help get more people involved.
That's not a bad idea. Maybe we should go to the blessed Slack with our group. Would anybody else be interested in participating in Slack? Because we have like a little Slack channel on I don't even know, Ben. It's basically your Slack. Are people interested in joining us and kind of chatting more often? Or are you on the main Node one already?
Yeah, I was going to point that out. I'm also in the package maintenance working group, and I tend to see more chatter in the channels now that we've established it as one of the, I guess not official, but trying to get more in real-time conversation happening there. I just joined, of course, the tooling the other day, just because I felt it was very in line to what we're doing a lot in the package maintenance working group, as far as like revolving around base practices and tooling comes up. So I figured, why not try to help out in both, or try to get that information so we can keep that baseline practice going in the Node.js world.
Cool. Well, what I will do as an action item will be to prod some of the key people from my own Slack who work on some interesting projects and see if I can get them over to the blessed Node Slack.
Blessed.
So well, that's who's it? Is it Raffle? You put it like
Yeah,
that,
it's a double-edged sword, because sometimes people get banned from blessed Node.js communities, but it cuts both ways. It is more public and visible.
I would say that I also do the same with the package maintenance group, because I know one of my colleagues who works with me at GoDaddy, he's very I guess informed around tooling. Ben, you might know him, Charlie Robbins.
I know Charlie.
Yeah, so like he joins that periodic. I know he's busy since he's higher up in the world than I am there, but I figured maybe I might prod him along to here as well.
We have all these. My thing is, we have all these interesting characters from NPM history who don't necessarily get as involved in Node as they could, and definitely don't get as involved in TC39 as they could. So if we could work our networks and get some of them chatting with us more, I think that could be valuable to Daniel too.
Yeah, much agreed, because I know I was at TC39 when it was just at GoDaddy, and I know Bradley Farias was another representative at GoDaddy, was there, or I guess he's known as Bradley Meek on the channels. I don't know how busy he is. Of course, he does a lot of things around TC39, a lot. So I don't know how much I can get him, but maybe at least I could try and prod Charlie along.
Yeah, we have a big history of Bradley being sort of one of the for a while he was the only person who would come to TC39 and say he was representing Node's concerns. And so and he's done a great job. And in addition, as we broaden the interaction, I'm learning about more diversity of opinions and more different kinds of concerns within Node. And so that's it's been really good. But yeah, Bradley's very active in TC39.
Oh yeah. As it was, he was very stressed out about just the running it all at GoDaddy. He's like, I didn't want to run it. I want someone else to do it.
What was I gonna say? Any other? That sounds great. So I guess the main action item is we're gonna make a Slack channel. It sounds, Chris, and invite folks we think would be good into it.
There already is a channel that's been created in the official Node Slack.
Cool. Glad you're more on the ball than I am, Ian. Good work.
Yeah.
I joined about 30 minutes ago.
Yeah. Great. Anything else? Any other pressing agenda items, Chris?
No. So nothing pressing. I did want to mention really quick that there was something about rimwrap might be easier to implement if we had, I don't know, it's like newer C-Lang support. But what's holding us back right now is a couple of IBM's platforms or their architectures. And so I talked to Sam Roberts, and he mentioned that, I don't know, he just had some concerns. He wasn't really, he wasn't convinced a lower level rimwrap implementation would be any faster than one implemented in JavaScript, because that's that's not where the bottleneck is. The bottleneck is IO, and the other thing is then he wasn't sure that. The other thing, of course, is it's a pain in the butt to implement. So, but we knew that already. So, maybe we can just kind of, I asked him to come into the repo and kind of explain himself, because I don't know. He knows about all that stuff. So, so look out for that one. I just mentioned it to him yesterday, and so I know I don't think he's gotten a chance to come and comment on that issue. But
fun update for me. We did get Node's own code base switched over to V8's built-in coverage, which was neat. That's been a long-term project. It's got some bugs, so hopefully people pitch in on the V8 end of things. But my new pet thing that I think is going to have a wider appeal to just tooling in general is I really want to start solving the source maps problem better, because anyone who's using source maps in TypeScript or Babel or whatever gets their error numbers completely shuffled around once an exception throws, because Node doesn't have good source map handling. So long story short, apparently it's on the roadmap of Chrome this year to have better source map support in V8 itself. I want to find out. I've been talking to Google already, and I want to see if we can get Node to have better source map support. Don't know what that looks like.
I really think part of the issue with source maps is the lack of a proper standard for them. I mean, part of it is not having support everywhere, but part of it is that the edge cases differ in certain places. And this is the kind of thing that standards can tighten down, because there are several implementations of the same interface, and standards can be a venue for helping them agree.
Well, we only have a minute left, but maybe this is a good segue to, maybe this is a good way for us to talk between a few different bodies then.
Mm-hmm.
Since there's the browser, Node, and it sounds like maybe it should be standardized better.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. So we gotta end it. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Daniel. And yeah, we'll catch you again in 3 weeks, and I'll post something about that Slack channel. Please join our Slack channel because you love Slack. Okay.
Yes, I will reluctantly move away from my own little cave.
Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Cheers.